Hey guys, how's it going? Terry here. Okay, hopefully the third time's a charm. This is the third time I've tried to make this video. This video is a follow-up, sequel, continuation, part two, from a video that I made a couple of days back, maybe 2 or 3 days back, titled, Who Told You That? Who Told You That? And it's a sort of, well, it's a study of the Genesis narrative and sort of a peek under the hood, under the very complex concept of accountability, our ability to sort of define ourselves, and it's sort of a very basic sort of overview. If you haven't seen that first video, this is basically what I was talking about. Genesis, first and foremost, is an extremely sort of difficult hurdle to get over with, theologically, narratively. The story structure, especially the specific creation narrative, there's a lot to unpack there just in the timeline alone. You know, did it have to be 7 days? You know, and what are the meaning of the days? You know, and why does a being that is powerful enough to create the physical universe just by speaking it into existence need to rest? I think, you know, I think there's a lot of symbolism and symbology and specifics to the narrative that are custom tailored. I'm not saying these aren't historical events, but they're custom tailored in the story structure to be repeatable. And by repeatable, I mean successively from generation to generation. I think that there is an aspect to human psyche that lends itself to us wanting to tell stories that are important to us. And you're talking about events that may have occurred that are historical events, but you've only got a specific set of cultural motifs, understandings, benchmarks, perspectives to describe these events, which are undescribable. And this is something that's been talked about before. You know, if you're a caveman and someone shows you an airplane, you might describe the airplane as a dragon or some other flying creature. It's definitely going to be like a bird. Anyone from a period before modern aviation. You go back far enough and you're somehow able to display a 747 or even a biplane to people that lived 1,000 years ago, and then give those people an opportunity to not even write it down, but just verbally tell what those stories are. They're going to do it in terms of some sort of organic flying. You know, it looked like a bat, a bird, a dragon, whatever, whether they use a mythical creature or something in their reality that, you know, that they already know to describe it. And that complicates our understanding of stories from antiquity. Specifically with the Old Testament, the biblical narrative of the Great Flood. Every culture from antiquity has, for the most part, you know, I hate the internet. I hate the fact that everything on the internet is like hyperbolic, like everything. But for the most part, one of the primary myths, monomyths, stories of humanity deal with at some point there was the whole planet was covered by water. Gilgamesh, many others. Those are the two most famous. Noah in the Bible, and of course the Gilgamesh story includes something like that. And it's just really fascinating to me. And, you know, the common theory is that you can go back and see that, you know, a volcano erupted, you know, 5, 6, 7, 10,000 years ago, and then interview tribes that have a direct lineage from that geographic location. And sure enough, in their spoken narrative mythologies that have been handed down across those thousands of years, they have some sort of supernatural variation on that same story. So what does that tell us about Genesis, the Bible, the Old Testament, some of those fantastical stories? It further complicates our understanding of them, or does it? is it just how we are? And is it possible that some of the larger than life fantastical details are specifically correct? And it's a slippery slope because I'm not necessarily a conspiratorial guy. I'm not what was aliens, the aliens came and built the pyramids. I don't believe that at all. I think humans are very good at coming together in numbers when directed. And by that I mean not democracies. It has to be a king. It has to be an authoritarian individual who's looked at as almost a god to order what are almost sometimes decades long, if not generational long, engineering feats, like pick the Colossus of Rhodes. Just look at Athens and Crete. No, and that's what's funny. People will look at the Great Pyramids and okay, that's aliens, or the Nazca Lines, that's aliens, or some other place. But no one is looking at any of the the dome of the Pantheon in Rome or the Pantheon in Athens and say, oh, they're those aliens. There's a fair amount of bias in that thinking and a lack of logic and a lack of sort of understanding of just what people can do with sheer numbers and a lot of creativity. So I'm not going in, that's how I sort of sift through certain, realities as far as the stories, the power of the stories, and their ability to talk about great things that happened. Genesis is still very tough to deal with, not just in 7 days of creation. As I said, why does a God who can speak everything into existence need a seventh day of the rest? The resting has a symbolic power to it. And the connection that God has with man, this creation, the creator and the created, is something that's intimate on a way that can't be defined, hasn't been defined, and throughout history we've struggled with as part of the what's our greater meaning sort of thing. And as an individual, you can sort of say, okay, I find great meaning in anything that I choose to find meaning out through the day. And that can work. Today was a great day. I got a chance to go to the gym. I got a chance to work out. I got a chance to kiss my mother and play with my kids, and had a great phone call with my, sibling that's in college, whatever it is you got to do. And you can sort of convince yourself day to day that those little magical moments, those intimate moments, those connections are enough for you to say that life has meaning. The problem is of course, when bad things happen, you're back to square one as far as the meaning of life, because there's a lot of suffering. And that's kind of the motivation of why I made the Who Told You That video, because the great thing about the Old Testament is that if you read it enough times, it reveals to you, not your interpretation of it, it reveals to you the very complex source of a lot of the suffering. The video that I spoke about, and I hope you go back and watch it. It's unfortunately, it's just me rambling like I always do. I try to make these things discussions. Adam and Eve are in the garden. They're told that they can eat and partake of anything in the garden except this one specific thing that they must avoid at all costs. And it's really fascinating because for people that aren't believers, that's your first objection right there once humans come into play. I mean, there's all sorts of objections for non-believers concerning the story. It's all so fantastical. But you could argue, well, isn't God setting up mankind to fail by this? Because one of the key aspects of our nature is the temptation of the one thing we're told we can't do versus everything else we can. And there's choice overload, and you just sort of, out of human curiosity, want to choose this other thing. But, we have agency as well. I'm contrasting that with reason and agency, and sort of, well, if there is something here that we're told not to speak, instead of me working through my own sort of process to just take it, why don't I ask for clarification at the right moment, time, and place, and try to get an understanding of why this boundary, this limitation is a boundary, especially when this is an authority, this is coming from a limitless authority figure. The test and understanding of agency in and of itself is part of the question. And it very quickly, because I think that this is a story meant to be passed down from generation to generation to generation, even though I believe it describes a historical event that's very complex and may have happened in a narrative that actually took place over an extended amount of time. The story is very simplified and short because it basically reads that Eve looked at the tree once she'd been convinced to have it. She saw that it looked good to eat, and it might seem like it was good to eat, and it was good that it might give them knowledge. So she took it, she ate it, she gave some to Adam, and he ate it. And that whole process is like 2 or 3 sentences, and that's another thing that kind of freaks me out about Genesis. But again, every old story that was passed down before for generations and generations before it was written is structured like that. The Iliad and the Odyssey, and I'm being timely here because we're waiting on another Odyssey, Christopher Nolan updated Odyssey movie. In the last video I talked about Disclosure Day. This time I'm talking about the Odyssey. It's believed that those were stories that were passed down from generation to generation to generation, and they're structured like that. There's a lot happening in short amounts of time, lots of information, and that was like, I guess, an action movie of their day. You go back 5, 6, 7,000 years or whatever, and people are around the campfire having these conversations, and so that's why the narratives happen so quickly, and you can jump from highlight to highlight, almost like an action movie. But what's interesting is that the next thing that happens is that they feel a sense of shame, which is very strange because weren't they already naked? But they're ashamed that they're naked, and they cover themselves and hide from God. God, who already knows this is happening and happened and would happen because he's omnipotent, is heard to be walking in the garden. He comes down and he's walking in the garden, and the Bible specifically says he's walking in the cool of the day. And I always found that strange. Cool of the day. Why do they have to even go into what the weather was like that day? It could have been a warm day, a hot day, a humid day, an incredibly freezing day. It's very interesting that I can only speculate that it mentions that it's the cool of the day to show how nice and perfect the world was. I don't know. It's something that you can only speculate on. But what's interesting is that he calls out to him, not both of them, not her. He calls out to Adam because Adam is the one to whom all mankind is accountable for, because he was created first as man. Women, as I said in the other video, have been taking slack and have been abused, and women have taken a lot of abuse throughout history for supposedly being the ones that instigated the fall of man, both secularly and, of course, theologically. Women have been considered second-class citizens in a lot of cultures for that, the weaker sex. Let's just say the weaker sex. Are they as physically strong as men? They're wired differently. They're a different gender, and they've got their own perspective and everything. But the weaker sex, okay, they're different. Women are different, a gender unto their own. But what's interesting and what I'm getting at isn't to excuse or add to that argument. I'm saying none of that takes away from the accountability of man, because God's interaction and conversation the whole time is with him, and he doesn't address her until after he's addressed him first. Adam responds, "Oh, well, we're hiding from you because we're ashamed." And God, the title of the last video that I'm getting, it's 15 minutes into this. I'm going to probably have to split this into 2. So the sequel itself will be a 2-parter. Who told you that? Who told you that attempted to give you a better understanding of who you are than I couldn't give you as your creator, that you believed this accuser, that you believe this person that made claims, that that you either did or didn't even take the time, because we can never be sure. All we know is what's written, that you didn't take the time to sort of process. What about the snake made him seem so much wiser than the word of God? Well, obviously his argument was much more eloquent than I think. I don't think Adam and Eve were dumb people. I think that the actual interaction, and this is just me, and you can disagree all you want, was obviously more complex and eloquent. And these were people new to creation dealing with something that obviously was just more than a snake or serpent. And that's another, the word used is serpent. I didn't go into this in the first video. All snakes are serpents, and not all serpents are snakes. When you're talking about cryptozoology, mythological creatures, entities, creatures, things that in the end of the Bible, in the book of Revelation, it does use the word red dragon. And I find that so interesting to describe the enemy, because you can draw a distinction between, in some cultures, a fire-breathing monster with an extended body that has wings and can crawl and all that stuff, and we just tend to call that a dragon. But a lot of times dragons are described as a type of serpent. There's a connection between those two entities. Oh, that's all I'm trying to say. You know, St. George and the Dragon, the famous painting. A serpent would be a type of entity. Of course, it doesn't have arms, you know, but I need to make a separate video about that and sort of better make that connection, because you're watching this and saying, no, a snake is a snake and a dragon is a dragon or whatever, but they both have scales, they both have heads, they both have the ability to sort of slither. Some serpents are sea serpents, some dragons are sea dragons, some, you know, there's a connection there. At least a literary one, because there's no proof of those existing either. We're just talking in the fantastical, using the fantastical to describe something that I think is still a historical event. God asks, who told you that? And what I think is one of many good answers later on, because, you know, God specifically, when he's speaking to Eve concerning, you know, there will be indemnity between your offspring and his, he's basically saying that I now have a process that I've already envisioned that will redeem mankind, but it is a process. And one of the things you quickly sort of figure out when you're dealing with the God of the Old Testament is that despite being absolutely omnipotent and omniscient, most of the interactions with given humanity allow for, basically, I'm going to say it like this, you know the word I'm going to use the word free will, but to make the word come home stronger, I'm going to use a different phrase. I'm going to use the phrase lovingly giving you enough rope to hang yourself, but trying to set things up so that you don't make the wrong choice and hang yourself. In America, in English, there's a phrase where when you know someone's about to do wrong, or there's a possibility of people doing wrong or making mistakes, and you don't want to micromanage them, helicopter parent, whatever you want to call it, we have a phrase called give someone enough rope to hang themselves, which is allow them the freedom to possibly make a mistake, and then sort of either have the choice to come in and rescue them before they actually make the mistake or not. But the general phrase is to give them enough rope to hang themselves. Not that you want them to hang themselves, but that may be entirely the case. But a lot of his interactions with human revolve around humans having, at least in the Bible, and as it is developed in the concept of Christianity, we have the ability to use free will and make choices. And even though he's aware of what those choices will be, and has complete premonitions, you know, he has to convince Abraham to do what Abraham does. He has to convince Moses through the burning bush to go. He has to convince and speak to David. It's relationship. And I find that so interesting, because what happens in antiquity when you're repeating a story from generation to generation to generation, it becomes something that connects people through those generations together, and the story becomes a foundational aspect to the relationship between generations and families. The word relationship and connection is so primary to what God seems to want from us. And indeed, when you're getting into the Christ, the Passion story, he alludes to, no one comes to the Father but through me. It's a relationship, a physical manifestation of God, who we refer to as the Son of God. But, the Son of in antiquity doesn't quite mean, just like regular offspring. It is of the essence of divinity. Again, probably for another video, because the last thing I want to do as I'm tackling what I'm tackling in this video is get into the divinity of Jesus. Again, that's a separate video. But what I do want to bring up with the who told you that, and why did you believe that over my ability to help you, show you who you are better as your creator, better than anyone else could, is Job. Okay, the book of Job. And I'm going to turn this video into a two-parter at the 2-minute and download these both, and then I'll get in why I think Job is a great answer to the question of who told you that and why. Okay, so I'm going to click this, and then you're just going to click the second video. Okay, so if you're watching this, this is Who Told You That Part 2B, Part 3. The book of Job is very famous in the Bible. It's one of those sort of like Jonah and the whale, or whatever animal he's swallowed up by. Again, extremely fantastical, but more disturbing because it's got the gut punch of God allowing suffering, which is a massive, massive, again, I think Job is one of, outside of Genesis and some of the other, take your pick. Job and Genesis are probably two books that are responsible for people not getting into the faith in the first place or leaving the faith if they're not taught philosophically correctly. And you know what I'm talking about. I know that seems like that's a loaded phrase, but the biggest gut punch about Job, as some people pronounce him, Job, is God is in council, and Satan, I guess, who still has access to heaven. Why is Satan given access to heaven? Shows up, and God is like, oh, where have you been? And Satan's basically going to and fro on the earth. I've been walking on the earth, going to and fro, seeing who I can devour. And why is that allowed? But even beyond that, ultimately Satan accuses God of only being loved, worshipped, and served, not because of who he is, but because of what he does. And when you put it that way, because it's more complicated, but that's really what's going on. And when you look at it that way, first of all, that doesn't really have anything to do with Job as an individual, other than God is pointing them out, saying that's not actually the truth. But the first one accused of, the first one being accused of being less than perfect or less than everything they're cracked up to be in Job is God. Because apparently Satan thinks that God is an idiot and doesn't realize that that is a factor. Because unfortunately there's a lot of aspects of humanity where, yeah, people worship God only when his blessings come through, sort of when the check is cashed, the bank note is fulfilled, the promise is kept, the prayer is answered. And it's very difficult, especially if we're living here in the physical reality, experiencing time minute by minute, day by day, week by week, year by year. Our whole lives are passing before us, and we seek out a prayer, ask for something, and then want it to immediately be answered, whereas God is working on his own timeline, in his own way, in his own will, and it involves things that are much bigger, much more complex, and much more just bigger than our simple requests. Not that we don't get what we want. It may not always come when or how or way we want it. There's many examples in the same Old Testament where people have to wait a very long time for a blessing they're anticipating. But what Satan is specifically saying is that whether it comes today or 10 years from now, people only really count on you and love you because of what you're doing for them and not you. And, which is what brings us to Job, because God is trying to make a point. And what makes it a gut punch is that you have to have a maturity to maintain your connection to God, separating the miracle worker from the miracle and still love and have a relationship with the miracle worker. That's something that you have to do soul searching. Like, I'm not here just because you're giving me stuff. And that's something that, when you put it that way, that's something that we struggle with each other. There's video on video on video, video upon video upon video online, talking about how certain women are hypergamous, which is women's need to sort of find men that are wealthier than them and taller than them, and 6'6", six-pack abs, six-figure bank accounts, over 6 feet tall. It's very ironic. I talk about the Bible and 666. But there are a lot of things in life, humans, as we seek our comfort and the simplicity of our own understanding, we become attached to what something does for us. And especially, we're normal. It's very easy and very quick for us to to become accustomed to that which is comfortable, and to mistake that which is comfortable as that which we deserve and that which we want to focus on. God wants us to focus on Him. And that's one of the reasons why I think He's so focused on working through people. He's all about the relationship, and sometimes we're all about the miracle. And like I said, you've got to separate the miracle worker from the miracle. Job loses his entire wealth and family in not even a day, but like it seems like it's an hour or a few hours, and continues in his faith in God, and to bless God, and to not curse God, but love God. And the devil has to come back and bring this up again for things to progress and escalate to a physical element. Again, the devil's like, oh, you're only here because of what you do for him. You take away his health, he'll curse you. And God says, okay, try me. And again, Job, who's just has no idea these conversations are happening in heaven. Okay, that's the gut punch. Job has no idea that the God and the devil are locked in some philosophical, spiritual thing. He's just suffering. He's just suffering. Okay, Job is just suffering, while Satan and God are locked in a philosophical, spiritual conflict. And we know how it all ends up eventually. Of course, everything works out. But let's do what a lot of people do. When you're in that moment, when the silence feels like rejection, but there's a plan. You're praying and there seems to be silence, but wait, there's a plan. There's a narrative. There's a victory already worked into, but you're in pain. But the end of your pain is coming, and it's already planned. You've lost everything. You've lost all your wealth, your cattle, your sheep. Of course, in that day, wealth was, these farm animals, your livestock. You've lost all of that, and including your children. But wait, God's going to replace them, and you'll see those children in eternity. See, the biggest issue with suffering, when it's coming from the supernatural, spiritual thing, is that it's all about the long game. And I know that sounds so cliche and cheesy and preachy, and all those feel-good, inspirational, cheap biblical movies and the corny Bible songs. It's all true. It's about the long game, and the fact that we live in time, often we lose our collective, as we are going through these events, not knowing the end. And we tend to forget that the victory has already been planned out, already existed. And that's why so much of the Christian music is that repetitive. Oh, the victory's already, because it's true. they're cliches because they're based on truth. They're tropes, as writers call cliches, whatever you want to call it. They're things that constantly are gone back to in the stories and the narratives and the songs and the movies and all that other stuff, because that is the fact. You know, God knew, again, after all of this, that in the end of it all, Job's suffering would be alleviated and he would be given his riches back, a new family, a whole new blank slate, clean beginning, as good as, if not even better than before. But while he was going through that, even his family, his wife, his family, his friends, and I love this expression, they were tearing off their clothes. You see that all in the Bible. Someone in authority gets some sort of news that they don't like, they don't want to hear, whatever. They rip their robes and all this other stuff. It's just wild. We all have experienced prayers and silence. You know, we've all experienced the frustration of being in a situation where we have prayed for something and thought, okay, we're abandoned. We prayed for something and we've heard silence. And then assumed it was rejection as these things start to spin around in our head. And it's very difficult to mature your way into your connection with God to where you can just trust God, trust the process, understand it. He knows you're suffering. He's very aware of it, well aware of it. You know, how do we know that to be true? Who in the Bible, in the Old Testament, ultimately just perished? That was just. Even when Jesus wept because he was late for his friends, you know where I'm going with this, because after Jesus wept at the death of his friend, he brought his friend back to life. That's the victory that all the Christian music songs and cheesy movies and all that other stuff are talking about, but it doesn't feel that way in the moment. You know, if you have a catastrophic, life-changing challenge, setback, death, you know, God forbid, it's, you know, I mean, you know what I'm talking about. Those disasters in life that really throw you for a loop. And if you're a believer, they challenge your faith. And when you get beyond those seasons, you're like, well, why did that even challenge my faith? That's just how God operates. You know, he's not a spiritual vending machine, and I am focused on the Creator and the miracle worker, and not the creation and, you know, the miracle. I'm focused on the miracle worker and not the miracle. I'm focused on my relationship with God. And it's incredible how easy the flesh has us thinking that we're sometimes very focused on the miracle. There's aspects of what the accuser did when he talked about, if you don't do, you know, there's aspects of what he said that are very true because of the way human nature works, and because of the way we can be very impatient, and sometimes for good reason, because nobody likes pain, but we can be very impatient with God and want to focus too much on what we want. And it's a strange thing, because we're offered a relationship and we're offered grace and salvation. We're not offered a perfect life. But all that again goes back to the first question God asked of not just of Adam, but of mankind after the fall. Who told you that? Well, probably the same guy that later told God that, well, they don't love you unless you do something for them. Probably the same individual, probably the same entity. I don't know who needs to hear this, but I think that is abundantly clear as far as the fall of man's sin. It does not relieve accountability, which it didn't escape accountability, you know. But again, also, like I said, Adam was the first one addressed because he was the leader. He was there, and then of course God took part of his body, specifically a rib. But I don't focus so much on the fact that it was a rib. Eve was made out of him. Humans were made to be joined together, a relationship. God wants a relationship with you. Our salvation came about through a relationship and a special covenant with a special group of people. The Creator God, who's powerful enough to speak everything into existence, time, space, and matter. And when I say time and space and matter, I mean in the beginning. It's time. God created heaven, space, and the earth. That's matter. Time, space, and matter, all created. And instead of saying God created time, space, and matter, it says that, in the beginning God created heaven and the earth, because it's very simplified. The purposes of the story are ultra simplifications so that they can be retold again and again and again and again and again, and we get them, which also gives it that ability to stick with mankind despite everything that happens, because the Bible's the best-selling book ever. Of course, one of the reasons of even it being mechanical printing being developed was so that they could mass produce Bibles, the Gutenberg Bible, the guy who invented the printing press. And even then, there are entire monks who were just, retranscribing the Bible. It's fascinating. But in response to the video that I made days ago, who told you that? Probably the accuser. And the accuser was probably speaking through the serpent. The accuser is an entity that also is spiritual, ancient, and has a motivation that is not for the greater good, and it makes you feel even worse as you pray for something. Okay, and God is putting you through a season to make you stronger, better, faster, harder, whatever, strong, to elevate you. And so you're praying for something and you hear silence, and not only are you impatient because of your flesh, but then the accuser walks into the scenario and the situation is like, he's abandoned you. The thoughts in your head that you need to question, that may not be your thoughts. The silence, well, it's rejection. It's a no, you're not worthy. And so it's very easy for the person who told you in the question, who told you that, to get, whether you're a new Christian or whether you've been following God all your life, to start wrapping your head around, well, I'm just not worthy. Clearly God is ashamed of me or short with me, or God is just trying to punish me, or God doesn't love me. All these things that sort of wrap themselves around your head and make it seem like you're just better off distancing yourself. That old phrase, God hates me, I hate my life, God hates me. I've said that. Everybody has. Everybody's felt that way. It's the accuser. It's the same entity that told Eve that she'd be like God by eating this fruit, is the one telling you that God's abandoned you when you're just going through a season. So that is, I think, the answer to the who told you that. And we know how everything works out for Job in the end. Everything is restored as it would be and should be, because if Abraham and Moses, who murdered a guy, and David, who murdered a guy and slept with his wife, murdered the guy in order to sleep with his wife, can find forgiveness. Not that they weren't punished and not dealt with, especially Moses and David. There's some times when they way slipped out of bounds and had to be corrected. But the God that asked, who told you that, in this relationship knew who told you that, but wanted you to learn from it, wants us to learn from it, wants us to have the ability to take the time, T-I-M-E, time. So I'm not just going to give you the answer right now because you won't understand it and appreciate it. This is going to take millennia to fix this. And in that time, mankind will progress. And in choosing me with your free will, we'll have this connection that is, again, that is deeper than deep. And I will offer you my salvation. Who told you that? The accuser, the same person that set the situation up to where God had to use Job as an instrument for mankind to understand one of the primary sources of suffering. So that's a lot of content. It's just a lot of me looking at down camera and speaking and philosophizing, and I hope that in some way it's touched, because this is a relaxed mood, and I wish there was a way to actually further interact, because I think each of these videos approach 20 minutes or 25. The first one might even be 30 minutes. But I want these videos to mean something to both the people new to the faith of Christianity and the people who've been walking with the Lord a while, because a lot of prayers, every prayer is answered, but not a lot of prayers are answered quickly, and there's a lot of silence or delay. It doesn't mean that there isn't movement in the spirit realm, and there's other stories that deal with what's happening in the spirit realm when you pray for something, and they involve the Prince of Persia, Daniel, and all that, it's 17 days, whatever. It blows my mind. It's another example. I'll get into that in another video, but there is an accuser that hops onto our physical flesh when we're praying for X, Y, and Z, that complicates things by making the negativity feel more intense. But the ending has already been seen, dealt with, and planned. And yes, the victory is already in existence. Accept that. And understand that God is well aware of the intensity and the pain that we're going through, but loves us and has grace and nothing but our best interests ultimately in the heart. And it is all about the long game with the Creator God. It is all about the long game and your ultimate restoration. Again, Moses can be forgiven with what Moses did after murdering a guy, and David can be forgiven. Anybody can be. You can't do worse than what those guys did at their worst. Paul, who was Saul, when new Christians, this is post the cross. Saul oversaw Stephen, an actual apostle's execution, and then became Christ's greatest early apostle. You can't do worse than those people. So I don't know who needed to hear that. And I'm sorry that this is all ultimately almost an hour's long, but that is the value of wisdom. It all takes time. I don't know who needed to hear that, but I hope you heard it. Stay blessed.